Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Rich. Today, all the way from Australia, we're joined by the host of the Managing Violence podcast himself, Mr. Joe Saunders. And in just a second, I'm going to invite Joe to introduce himself and to our audience. But as always, I need a moment to prepare myself. Let's go ahead and get logged on here to the old Facebook. Looks like the notification went out that we are on, so people will start jumping on. Let's see. There we go. Click that. Oh, magic of live TV. Here we go. Okay, got 15 people on already. Please like and share. You're definitely not going to want to miss today's show. We've got all the way from the other side of the world, Mr. Joe Saunders, the host of the Managing Violence podcast, is on today. A behavioral science nerd himself, Joe Saunders. We're excited to have you on the show, sir. Good morning.
Hey, good evening to you. I said to you offline, it might be Coffee with Rich, but it's Wild Turkey with Joe at the moment. It's 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night here, so forgive me, I'm not morning drinking.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I'll be having a bourbon myself tonight. Let's see who we got on the show. Joe, got a lot of folks joining us. Gerald is on, coin number 952 from Oregon. And if you wonder what a coin number is, got to be a member of the American Warrior Society to get a serialized coin and get access to all of our training programs. And if you want to check out more about that, in the show links today, I have all the ways that you can contact Joe and consume Joe Saunders' content, his Managing Violence podcast, and some of the content he's got on YouTube. It's all in the links today, as well as how to find out more about the American Warrior Society, the sponsor of today's show. Kevin is on. Stephen Washington. Good morning, Stephen. Jared from Montana, James Vick, Karen is on, Jason Johnson, my old brother Jeff Brown knows a little bit about violence. Jeff, you'll enjoy today's show. Greg is on. Lots of folks join us. 23 people on. Please like and share. Take a brief moment to hit that share button, put it somewhere or someone who really needs this content, because today we're going to have an amazing discussion with someone that I've admired and respected for some time now, Mr. Joe Saunders. Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself, man. How did you end up here on Coffee with Rich?
Well, that's an excellent question. You invited me, I guess. But okay, a little bit about me. Look, this can be a really long story. It can be a really short story. I'll start with the short, and feel free to drag any details out you like. But essentially, I was a pretty normal middle-class kid growing up in suburbs of Brisbane, which is in Queensland, with one of the northern states of Australia. And pretty normal home life. I got into martial arts very early. Both my older brothers were into Taekwondo when I was growing up, and I was the baby brother. My brothers were 13 and 15 years older than me, so I kind of idolized them. And they would come home from tournaments and give me the medals and give me the trophies, and I was the baby brother. So I thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. So as soon as I turned 4 or 5 years old, I got in and I started training as well. And my family moved around a little bit while I was young. And every time we moved to a new town, I basically had to pick up a new martial art, because looking back on it, I didn't realize at the time, but mum and dad were basically just figuring out what was cheap and what was local. So these are your options. In one town it's boxing, in another town it's karate, in another town it's something else, right? So as a kid who just wanted to be a black belt, that was frustrating because I didn't get to progress through belts. But looking back on it as an adult, it was an amazing gift to be able to build a foundation across a whole bunch of different theories of combat and martial skills. But fast forwarding, as a teenager, I got into grappling arts, and I got into that through wrestling. And wrestling was it's very uncommon. Well, it was very uncommon in Australia at the time. This is pre the explosion of UFC. The UFC brought wrestling up here, where now MMA clubs mostly have wrestling classes. But prior to that, you couldn't find wrestling anywhere here. There was maybe 1 or 2 tournaments a year in the whole country. So wow. It was a small sport, but I was a pro wrestling fan growing up, and I just happened to be lifting weights at a what we call a PCYC, which I guess is kind of like a YMCA. And I saw some guys in a corner suplexing each other on mats. And I was like, that looks cool. I wonder what those guys are doing. And I went over there, and there's an older gentleman who was actually a former assistant coach of the USSR national wrestling team. And he was the coach, and he was working as a janitor and just happened to be coaching a couple of guys who were doing early NHB MMA fighting. Basically fighting for tickets and hot dogs at the time. It wasn't a glamorous sport, but he was training these guys, and I joined in. And that was probably the first time. I was about 15 years old, and that was the first time that I really learned what it meant to train hard, because I'm sure anyone who's a listener that's wrestled before, you know that no one trains harder than wrestlers. And I'd done all sorts of sports, but nothing ever tested me the way wrestling did. And it gave me a different appreciation of what it means to really train for combat. And so anyway, wrestling led me into judo. Judo I made the switch to judo because I love submissions, and also because I could compete every 3 weeks in judo. There was a lot of judo competitions. And I was at this time, 16, 17-year-old kid. I wanted to be able to compete and do something with what I was doing, what I was learning. Judo led me into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I ended up spending time on the Australian sumo wrestling team. I went around the world doing sumo wrestling. So like there's some really big rabbit holes there we could go down. But I guess probably what led me into what I do now was when I was at university or college, I was broke like every other first year university student. And I decided I wanted to be less broke. So I was looking for work, and hey, I was 6'3", 250 pounds, and I was on the Australian judo team. And I thought, I'm sure I could get a job bouncing. So that's what I did. And here, the legal drinking age is 18, so you can start bouncing at 18. And that's what I did. I started bouncing, and quite quickly worked out that there was a significant gap between my physical skills and what was actually needed for real violence. With weapons and multiple people and communication and screaming witnesses and girlfriends and drugs and alcohol and all this sort of stuff that was just not what happens in the dojo or in the wrestling gym. And that kind of led me down a rabbit hole, figuring out how do I fill those gaps. And I spent the next 15 years training with the best people in the world that I could come across that could help me fill those gaps. And eventually that led me into corporate, what I do now, which is essentially I'm a risk management consultant specializing in behavioral risk and occupational violence. So I work with organizations to keep their staff safe from violence in the workplace. So there's a lot more to it, but I guess that's a short version.
Joe, we have a very similar background, my friend. We moved around a lot, as my brother Jeff, who's on here this morning, will tell you. And part of that is, just like you said, we had to, every town was some, I'm chasing a belt, but because you're moving, you don't have access to that, right? So that was a problem. And then I got into bouncing and bounced for years. And been there, done that. Very similar background.
Very cool, man. Yeah, look, I wouldn't change it for the world now. At the time, it was frustrating, but hey, makes you who you are, right?
No, absolutely. Let me check my audio real quick. We lost you for a second, and I'm afraid that my audio may have. Do I sound okay?
Yeah, you sound fine to me.
Okay, perfect. Very similar background. I think that being a bouncer for years really helped when I went into corrections and became a law enforcement officer. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly, Joe, as probably anybody who's on here this morning. The things that you learn about violence in the dojo really don't correlate really well with bouncing, because, like you said, you laid it out very visually. The chaoticness of drunk and screaming girlfriends and weapons and multiple attackers, and the challenges of the pool tables on about a platform that's a little bit higher, beer mugs. I mean, none of that stuff was in the dojo.
No, and no one grilled you for hours after the sparring match either to question why you did what you did, and you didn't have some law student with a barrister father threatening to take your liberties away because you threw his son out of a nightclub.
That's an interesting point. The first club I worked at, they were really good about that. At the end of the night, we had to debrief every use of force incident. And the head of security would log it all down so that he could talk to it the next day if and when the police showed up to figure out what happened, who shot John. But Some of the other clubs I worked at didn't, and I was always shocked at that. Like, oh man, the club's open itself to a lot of liability.
Mm. Yeah, man, it was the same here. I mean, it was very hit and miss. I mean, the first company I worked for were very, very good. Like everything had to be documented. And that was just because they'd learned their lessons. They knew the ramifications of not having that in black and white when 3 months later someone wants to press charges. It's, but other companies, not so much.
Yeah. Thank you to the 26 folks that are joining us this morning. Please like and share. We're just getting started. Will is on. Tiny is on. Kat is on. John from Yukon, Oklahoma is on. Kevin, my good friend Will Parker out in Montana is on. Donald is on from occupied Virginia. Dallas is on. Good morning, Dallas. Okay, let's get into some more of the questions here. So you own and are the main host of, or the host of, the Managing Violence podcast. Joe, I'm going to throw you this question here. What is violence, man?
Whoa, man. Let's start with something easier. What is violence? Like, there's a whole bunch of dictionary definitions I could give you. What I consider violence is the deliberate use of force, coercion, or discomfort against another human being to achieve an outcome. And that's, I don't limit it to physical violence. It can be words. It can be, we can talk about political violence. We can talk about, social violence. We can talk about oppression. We can talk about bullying and harassment and gaslighting and all that kind of stuff. It's all violence. And I think to say it's not violence is to discredit the impact that can have. Certainly psychological warfare is, it's been around since Sun Tzu for a reason, right? It works. Yeah. So that's my definition. Anytime you're using some sort of force or some sort of coercion to achieve an outcome.
Well, in that regard, that you're using coercion to get an outcome, is violence morally ambiguous, or would you say that can it ever be used for good? I guess is what I'm getting at.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'd like to think I've used violence for good. It's unfortunate, but to me, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, before we went live, to me, violence is just a form of communication, right? It's an extreme form of communication. It's ballistic communication, right? But it's still communication. I'm still sending a message, right? And you can still reply. Mm-hmm. The way you act or the way you retaliate, that's another form of communication that I've got to decode and analyze and figure out what it means to me, right? So it's to me, it's like if you say violence is always wrong, that's like saying shouting is always wrong.
Yeah.
We don't want to shout at each other when we're having polite conversation, but sometimes you have two old men debating each other and someone has to shout. So
yeah, sorry, absolutely.
We went there too early.
Yeah, because one of the questions I was going to ask you, is we had one of our political leaders, Joe, here in the United States, Joe Biden, former vice president. I'm sure you probably heard of him.
Oh, yeah.
Well, recently, he was asked to denounce Antifa and some of the other far left groups that are committing a lot of acts of violence across our country. And he said, look, I've denounced all forms of violence. And that struck me as not just hollow, but really short-sighted, because I agree with you. I think violence is a form of communication. I think violence can be used for good. But I wanted to get your thoughts on like state-sanctioned violence, because the legal, necessary, and justified use of state-sanctioned violence and how that has changed the course of human history innumerable times, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of my favorite guests I've had on the podcast, and someone I'm very honored to call a friend now, Rory Miller, who is a corrections officer and now probably the world to me probably the best author in the world when it comes to writing about violence in a way that makes things very easy to understand. And Rory said the first time I spoke to him, he said the worst lie that's ever been told is that violence doesn't solve anything. Violence solves lots of things. And throughout human history, violence has solved probably more things than words has, right? And it's just a matter of, it's like anything, it can be used well, it can be used poorly, it can be used judiciously, it can be abused. And it's all about the application of that tool. The same as I know with your listeners, you'll relate. There's nothing wrong with a firearm. It's how the person uses the firearm. There's nothing wrong with carrying a firearm. It's how you carry the firearm, right? It's those are the things that dictate good or bad, or justified or not justified. To denounce violence as a whole is to say, well, let's just be a complete pacifist nation and disband a military and have no law enforcement, which is it's never happened, right? No one's ever successfully done that. At least not willingly. I mean, Japan did it after the Second World War, but even they're trying to get things back on track. So, yeah, it's silly. It's short-sighted. To me, it's complete political gamesmanship to appeal to people that want to hear that. I don't think there's any intention behind that of actually sticking to a zero violence. We're going to disband the military. I mean, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, let's go back to Rory Miller, man. I tell you, I started reading his books probably, I don't know, 10 or more years ago, fell in love with his stuff, Meditations on Violence. He's got a book called Scaling Force, which I thought was phenomenal. And I think that one of the things that as a police officer, you learn to scale force, right? You got a use of force continuum, and that governs when, where, and how you can use what level of force that's appropriate. And I think that's one of the problems that civilians have, is scaling the force in the violent conversation that they're having, if you will. And that a lot of times they go here in the United States specifically, Joe, a lot of us are concealed carriers, and maybe some folks go to the gun too quickly. Whereas if they knew how to scale that force, if they just read Rory's book, it would probably serve them better. Would you agree?
I agree. I think there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle when it comes to comfort with scale. And I think a lot of that is to do with confidence at different levels and different skill sets. A lot of people that carry a firearm, and look, I'm not coming from a gun culture, and the last thing I'm ever going to be is an Australian telling Americans about gun laws, right? That drives me crazy, right? So I'm not going to be that guy. But for a lot of people that have no other training, the gun is their sense of security. It's their in case of emergency, break open glass. But because they have no ability to de-escalate, they have no situational awareness, they have no personal security skills, they have no hand-to-hand skills, they have no ability to be able to break and run. They might not even be fit enough to run away even if they had the ability to run away. So the only thing that they feel they can do is go to that firearm. But because they have no confidence in those lower level skills, how do they choose when to do that? You wait too long, you're dead. You go too soon, you're in jail. So how does that work? For a little while, I managed a security team. Very, very rare here in Australia, but where I live, the Jewish schools have armed security, right? And that's incredibly rare here in Australia, to have armed security guards doing anything, let alone at a school, right? And I was responsible for managing these guys. So I had to train them. I had to make sure all the boxes were ticked, and basically offer on the ground support. And I had some significant challenges trying to get through to management. They put a lot of money into firearms training, which is fantastic. Obviously, they wanted to mitigate that risk. These guys were shooting once a month. For perspective, our police shoot once a year, right? So our guards were shooting 12 times as much as the police, and they were shooting better. They were doing simulation training. They were doing room clearing. They were doing tactical scenarios. They were doing really high-level training, but they had zero training afforded to them each year in how to use batons, how to use handcuffs, how to use hand-to-hand skills, how to do verbal de-escalation. And I said to them, to our management team when I came in, I said, guys, this is great that you want to make them excellent at shooting, and the decision-making was good. But if we ever shoot somebody and a prosecution wants to pull up our training records and said, these guys have had 200 hours this year on the firearms range, and 0 hours doing any lower level use of force, and they went straight to a lethal force, how does that look? Yeah, it looks like we're negligent. Yeah, and we were 100%. Our guys were much more comfortable shooting than they were fighting, and that's a problem.
No, that's a great point. And I think that that ties in nicely, Joe, to the discussion we were having about the legal use of violence. We should be looking at it, turning the coin around and looking at it from a legal perspective, like you did, and said, hey, look at this, guys. We've got all this training going on with regard to the firearm, and we're neglecting the ground skills, the subduing and restraining skills, the verbal de-escalation. all the things that says, hey, we use these tools in order before we got to the firearm. Now, of course, sometimes you go straight to the firearm depending on the threat. I get it. But before we go much further, I want to say, please like and share, specifically share. We're going to take a quick share break before we get much further in here and give all you guys and gals an opportunity to hit that share button. Share it into a group that you're on Facebook. Share it to someone that needs it. Share it on your page. I don't really care where you share it, but take a quick second and hit that share button before we go any further. As you can tell, this is going to be a really good discussion today. Okay. In your bio, Joe, it says that you are a behavioral science nerd. Unpack that for us, will you, sir?
Yeah. So look, man, I've always been fascinated with, if I was going to summarize it, so why would smart people do stupid things? That's my question. Like, why do we do dumb things? And that kind of grew into why do we do anything? And that kind of just built into this fascination with the human psyche. And the first realization for me that made me go, was the realization that we don't really solve problems logically. We solve problems emotionally, and then we justify them later with logic. And then I was like, "Oh, I wonder where else we do that. I wonder where else we." I think it was Robert Heinlein said, "Man is not a rational animal; he's a rationalizing animal." And I was like, "Oh, I like that. I like that a lot." So that kind of just led me down this rabbit hole. And I'm not someone who likes to read stuff I agree with. I like to get different opinions. For example, I've interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman on my podcast. His work was certainly foundational in a lot of law enforcement training on psychology of killing and combat. But I've also interviewed Matt Larson from West Point a couple of times, and Matt has a completely different viewpoint to Dave. And I don't know who's right because they're both smarter than me, right? So I just like to listen to both of them and go, well, that sounds good. And yeah, that actually makes sense too. And I just get to benefit from everybody's opinion. So I guess why I call myself a behavioral science nerd is that I'm always reading this stuff. I'm always looking into it, trying to understand it, trying to see what breakthroughs are coming. Human beings are a pretty fascinating thing to study.
Again, Joe, you and I have a lot in common. I got a degree in social psychology just for that very reason. I mean, I didn't necessarily need to get the degree for my career as a Marine Corps officer, but I did anyway, and I wanted to study. I was in human animal. That is the how humans are irrational, but there are irrational and rational ways. And there's a really good book. It's written by a PhD. I can't think of his name. Called Predictably Irrational, and there's another one called Bozo Sapiens. And I think
Dan Ariely was the first one. I've never heard of Bozo Sapiens. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, you'll have to check that out, man. But I just read a really good book by Malcolm Gladwell. Just finished it last week called Talking to Strangers. Have you read that one yet?
I haven't read it, but I've had it recommended to me before.
Oh, phenomenal, man. Everybody needs to read it in the context of how we can misunderstand and misinterpret the signals coming from someone else, and all the fascinating science behind how we miscommunicate. And of course, it's important to understand that, because I think, as you may or may not agree, Joe, it's oftentimes those miscommunications and verbal communications that lead to violent communications. Would you agree with that?
100%. And look, I broadly break things down into two categories. You've either got social violence or asocial violence. Social violence being something that has originated from conversation, whether that's been, it doesn't have to be verbal conversation. It could be a look. It could be you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in terms of like you're actually in the wrong territory, you've broken a social, you've made a faux pas that you weren't aware of, whatever, but you've somehow communicated something that's upset somebody. And then it escalates from there. That's generally social violence. And then asocial is where it's cold-blooded, it's predatory, it's planned, it's got to do with an outcome. So that could be anything from bag snatching to rape and murder to terrorism, right? It's not something you can de-escalate because it was planned, and the control strategies are different. But I think that what most people think of when they talk about violence is the first category. It's it's an ego fight or a challenge or a disagreement that escalates. And to be honest, 95% of those can be solved by someone either knowing the right thing to say or avoiding the wrong thing to say. So, yeah. Nearly always those can be de-escalated.
Yeah. 26 folks on this morning. Thank you for joining us. I know it's real early. I'm looking at where some of you folks are from out on the West Coast, and it is really early where you are. But please like and share. It's not early where Joe's at. I think it's 9:30, 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, nearly 10 o'clock at night. Yeah, it's all right. It's a Friday night. I'm good.
Right on, man. Matt is on. Donald is on. My good friend Dave Frazier is on. Alan Kelly is on. Stephen had to go back to class. He's a school teacher up there in Michigan, I believe. Wow. Please like and share. I want to go back to one or two of the things you said, Joe. Last week, we were on vacation up in Montana visiting Glacier National Park, and my son called. One of his friends was killed here on the Cumberland Plateau. We live in a very rural county in a very rural state in a very rural part of the country. But what's specifically special about where we live here on the Cumberland Plateau is the writer Malcolm Gladwell wrote in his book Outliers how statistically it's one of the most violent places on the earth. And you wouldn't think that if you were here in the beautiful rolling hills and farmers and stuff like that, but it's because the inhabitants grew up in herding cultures in Scotland and Ireland, and they took that culture of honor and supplanted it here. And why I'm talking about that relative to my son's friend being murdered, he was having sex with somebody else's girlfriend, and they walked in, and these two 20-year-old men decided to go for their guns, and one killed the other one. So this kind of thing happens here. We still have feuds ongoing. There was a shooting that led to the retaliation came in the form of, he took a high-powered rifle from across the road and shot the other man's jaw off, his father's jaw off. So I guess these forms of violence and retaliation and things like that that you talked about, Joe, are still alive and well, and we need to recognize the things that lead us to those forms of violence, right?
Oh, 100%. And I think it's so arrogant that we think we've evolved past our primitive urges, and we haven't. We've just put layers of social control on top. And whenever something happens that strips back those layers of social control, we revert back to what we've been doing for thousands of years. And and stripping back that social control could happen like a shortage of a basic need, right? Electricity goes out, people lose their minds. You can't get toilet paper, people start stabbing each other. Right? We had that here, right? We had people getting stabbed over toilet paper back in March. It's absurd, but that's what happens because it reveals, once that we feel like society is not protecting us and insulating us in the rules, then we just go back to whatever we've been programmed for, which is feuds and tribalism and hierarchy and all that stuff that was necessary for so much of our evolution.
Yeah, I was just taking notes because this is such a great conversation, man. I'm going to have to beg you to come back on the show because I want to unpack all of this. One of the things you talked about with regard to social control, I think sounds very similar to something that another guest we had on here, Dr. T.C. Fuller, retired FBI agent, and you'll have to get TC on your show. He's a brilliant guy, wrote a book, Reasonable, Necessary, and Justified, talking about violence.
Okay.
And one of the things that he talks about is that when there's a violation of the social contract that we have between the governed and the governing body, because if there's state sanctioned violence, we say that the police officers here in the States, we give them a monopoly on the state sanctioned use of violence, and then they fail to act like we've seen in several cities where they've just pulled back, not only allowed the city to be burned, but allowed their police precincts to just be overwhelmed and burned and destroyed. Then we see that Americans are having to pick up their rifles. That's one of the reasons I guess we have the Second Amendment, and defend themselves, defend their homes. And I don't know if you saw the Kyle Rittenhouse situation.
Yes, I have. Okay.
That's a classic example, I think, of what you were talking about, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, no, it is. And as soon as the, I guess the luxury of society fails us, we find out whether we are able to look after ourselves or not. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the training I deliver, even corporately here in Australia, is that if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And, sure everyone has seen it at some stage in their lives, but basically you've got your safety and physiological needs at the bottom, and then as you go up, you get the luxuries like relationships and love and belonging and self-esteem and all those kind of nice to have stuff. But because most of us in a first world society never have to worry about our safety or our security because that's provided for us, when something goes wrong at those levels, it completely rocks us to our core because we have no resilience built there. We've never had to deal with it before. And we just are completely unprepared and we don't know what to do. We overreact or we underreact. And everything just goes to hell. And we pray that eventually someone who knows what they're doing will take control. The worst thing is when no one knows what they're doing and someone decides they're taking control anyway, and then we'll see where that goes. But it's quite interesting to see when COVID first hit us here in February. I went on record and said our first world privilege is about to get a third world wake up call. Because I could see a lot of unemployment, a lot of people struggling, and whenever that starts to happen, people start fending for themselves. If my children are starving, all of a sudden, all those social contracts that I was okay with when I had plenty, I might be reevaluating my position on those, right? So good people end up doing desperate things, and that changes things completely. Now you're in a completely different set of rules, and the rules are only good if both sides know they're playing by them. If one side decides they don't play by the rules and everyone else is still playing by the rules, now you get problems.
Wow, I love that. Say that again. We're getting a third world wake up call. Say that again, Joe.
Yeah,
Steal that.
Our first world privilege is about to get a third world wake up call.
Wow, that's so spot on. John says, have you followed Tim Larkin Total Focus Training?
Yeah, I actually had Tim on the podcast maybe a couple of months ago. Really, really good guy. Really good guy. I haven't trained his material, so I can't vouch for it one way or another. But Tim's a really genuine guy, and I think he's got some really cool concepts.
Well, to go all the way back to the beginning of the show, I think I would agree with you. At the time, I was really frustrated as a young man because we were moving a lot and I was having to switch from karate to taekwondo to judo to Ishinryu, and I was just all over the map. But then 1994 rolls around, and by that point, I think I was in judo, but I was also a Marine Corps close combat instructor. So I'd been to all that Marine Corps stuff too. So I think that, when the UFC came out, we're like, okay, here we go. We're going to find out what works. And it was something that was not even on my radar. I don't know about you, man, but I'd never heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu until that day.
Yeah, no, it was a wake up call for everybody. And look, I mean, we didn't even get it live here. Like I didn't see the first UFC until about 1998. Right, so I found a VHS tape in like a Blockbuster video, and it was like tucked away back with the adult videos in the back corner. Right, I was like, "Whoa, what's this?" I thought it was pro wrestling. I was like, "Oh, I'll pick that up," and then I watched it. It's like, "Hey, these guys are actually hurting each other. This is interesting." But yeah.
Yeah, well, when it came out, my business partner, best friend, Mike Seeklander, and I, he was training to be, I think, a fighter at the time. We were at Tommy's training center, and a bunch of us fighters sit around in his little shack / dojo and watch this thing eating, I think, beef stew, and just like, oh man, what's going to happen? And we didn't, at the time we were strikers, man. I didn't really see. But what's funny about that, Joe, is we were doing all the striking training, and then we were going to work as a bouncer and using a lot of standing grappling and wrestling techniques. So it's like it should have been apparent then, but for some reason it just didn't.
Yeah, man. Look, I think it's important that you have all the tools in the toolbox because you never know when you're going to get a tricky problem that requires a different solution to normal. And I was the opposite, man. When I started bouncing, I was much more comfortable with grappling, and I got my head kicked in and got my nose broken and got bottled because of that. Because I took someone to the ground that I shouldn't have taken to the ground. Yeah, you learn the hard way. Thankfully, I'm here to joke about it rather than talk to you through through a tube.
Yeah, I hear you. Let's see. Dr. John Adine is on. Good morning, Dr. Adine. Donald is on. Walt is on. Donald is on. I call it dog eating dog. He says, Alan says he hit the nail on the head about the wake up call. Yeah, I agree with you, Alan. I think he did as well. And Alan, I think you spent 3 decades as a state trooper in Virginia, so you know what you're talking about when it comes to violence. 31 folks on. Please like and share. We're just about halfway through this amazing show this morning with Joe. So thank you again for coming on.
Enjoy.
Let's see. What has the current unrest in the world, but specifically the States, taught us about the nature of conflict and/or conflict management?
I think we probably just touched on it a little bit. I think whenever there's unrest and things get less comfortable, we have to see how comfortable we are with being uncomfortable, right? We have to see how well we cope at that level. I'll sidetrack and come back to that question because it's something that was a really interesting experience for me. A couple of years ago, I was delivering some training for a domestic violence shelter in Alice Springs, which is like, if you look at a map of Australia, it's pretty much smack bang in the middle. Like, it's the middle of the desert. There's nothing going on. It's it's difficult to get to. It's like I'm not even really sure the history of why it's even a city, but it is. Anyway, it's so I'm in Alice Springs, and it's got a very heavy Indigenous population there. Right, it's in an area with the Northern Territory, which is got the highest Indigenous population of anywhere in the country, and a lot of the ladies that I was training were actually refugees. They had come from other countries, or they had been basically sent wherever there was a need, and they needed workers in Alice Springs, and they ended up there. So I'm doing my normal thing, talking about stress and fear and managing adrenaline, and I was talking about Maslow, and I was talking about managing that when something goes wrong that challenges our safety or our security, we overreact. And I had two ladies on the course, both of them in their early 20s, and both of them were from South Sudan. And unbeknownst, they didn't know each other at all until they both arrived in Alice Springs as social workers. And they had both come over as refugees. They had both been involved in the genocide in South Sudan. And they had both been victims of basically military occupation of their villages. And this one lady was telling me, like, I'm talking about stress from talking about bouncing, right? And a guy with a knife or a bottle or something. And she's talking about they had a situation where the military came through and basically slaughtered everybody in their village. And as a 13-year-old, she had to hide under the corpses of her loved ones for 3 days until the I think it was the rebels, not the actual military, but until the rebel force moved on. And she would tell me that at nighttime she would crawl through the bodies to get water to bring back to her little brother who was there with her, right? And I'm trying to teach her about stress. Everything just was like, I can't relate to that. I can't possibly relate to what a 13-year-old girl goes through, having to crawl through corpses of her loved ones to be able to go get water and come back and pray that she's not shot as well, or that she comes back to her brother and he's not dead because he cried out at the wrong time. And I'm trying to teach her about stress and coping under adversity. It's absurd. And then the fact that both of them came out of that situation, decided to dedicate themselves to studying and becoming social workers, and then went to help other people, right? In what is a comparatively privileged country. That says a lot about them. But I was talking to them at lunchtime later, and I guarantee they wouldn't be sweating over the fact that we couldn't get toilet paper. I guarantee that wouldn't even been a blip on the radar. But when you've got people that will lose their mind because their favorite candidate of The Bachelor got voted out last night, and that will affect their entire week, how do you expect them to cope when society falls apart? Yeah, I have this theory that human beings create. We have to have something to fight. We have to have a battle to fight. We have to have something to be upset about. I think it's in our DNA because for most of our evolution, we've had legitimate life and death struggles. Like probably on a monthly basis, right? Something tried to kill us, or we were going to starve to death if we didn't catch something. That was a normal part of our existence. And in a very nice, pasteurized, provided for, privileged society, we don't have those issues anymore. So we magnify the issues we do have, so they take up relative importance. And I think that's why you see massive divides over politics, massive divides over sport. Like, it's absurd, but I think that's a lesson in humanity, that in the absence of real problems, we magnify little problems.
Yeah, just on that, we were in, like I said, on vacation last week, and the little coffee shop was out of pumpkin spice latte. And all these women that came in there wanting their PSL and couldn't get it, they were pissed off, man. And I'm like, dude, are you serious? Because, in my 23 years in the Marine Corps, I've traveled extensively around the world. I've been to Africa, all over Europe, all over the Middle East and Asia. And I've seen what a privileged and amazing country we have here. So many Americans don't travel internationally and they don't get those experiences. Now, does someone need to crawl out from underneath or spend 3 days underneath the bodies of their loved ones to get it? Of course, I think that obviously, Joe, you get it. You definitely get it. And the fact that you can go and train people, I think is a blessing that you're giving those folks. Now, those women in the Sudan, obviously, they have a very unique experience, unlike what 99.9% of the people on the planet will probably ever have to go through. However, the fact that they're willing to share and teach and train and be part of the solution is what an amazing story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just the chance of them even ending up together in this foreign country in the middle of nowhere, like in a place that I'd never been to before, and they just end up in the same center doing the same job. It's crazy. But
yeah. And well, several years ago, President Trump got himself in a lot of hot water right out of the gate with saying this. He made a remark about shithole countries, referring to sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti and stuff like that. I don't know if you remember that, Joe.
I do recall. Yeah.
And I made a remark on our podcast, something about, well, yeah, I've been to a lot of those places and they're shitholes. And my brother's on here; he's been to a lot of them as well. And so somebody had me on their show to kind of not necessarily defend it, but to unpack that a little bit, because he just says something like that and it goes out into the ether and people think he's a racist. I said, it has nothing to do with the race. And I'll give you a case in point. I work with a 501c3 company here in America to hire folks coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and we put them to work in our company. And we pay them twice the minimum wage. We work with them on life skills and stuff like that. And it's an amazing program with these refugees. And a lot of them are coming from these countries, specifically Burundi. And on the happiness index, I believe Burundi was country number 145 out of 154. And this is African statisticians putting this data together these are Africans using African data, and the people are miserable. Now, it has nothing to do with the people. I will tell you, if I'm hiring these guys, they're just as talented and brilliant as anybody that works for us, but they're fleeing a shithole. Pardon my French. I mean, these people are miserable. They want to come here because of what, Joe? The very bottom of that Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, right? The very bottom of that pyramid, safety and security. And then once they get here and they see it eroding before their eyes, it's pretty scary for them, because they know where this can lead. Correct?
100%. And look, that's the thing people don't understand. When you haven't had those things threatened, you don't understand how everything else loses its importance. Like, if you imagine you're stranded in the desert and you don't know if you've got enough water to get through until nightfall, you are not at all concerned about being lonely. Right? That the only thing that is in your mind is, I need to get water. I need to find some way to get water, right? Or I need to be able to survive. It's not about whether I feel whether my job is fulfilling, or whether the president said something mean I disagreed with and I need to write a letter about that, or how many likes my Instagram post got. Like, none of that matters at all, because there's a more amplified problem, and people that are leaving countries where those needs are not provided for. And by the way, that's the majority of the world. I think we miss that. We lose sight of that when we talk about privilege. Yeah, the majority of the world has these issues. I mean, I'd be interested to do the numbers of what percentage of the world is actually below the poverty line, but we have it good, and it's not for us who have it good to be offended on behalf of someone who doesn't. Right? Unless you've lived that experience or have a pretty close approximation of it, you need to shut up and just do your best to help.
Well, and the case in point is, I think, a good case for, of course, they I think the juxtaposition or maybe they were conflating the fact that there are brown people that live in those countries that Trump called the bad word, and therefore he's saying something about race. And I said it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with culture and the governments in which they live in. And the case is easily made with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They share the same island. They're the same ethnic background of people, the same brown people, if you will. And Haiti is a shithole, and Dominican Republic is pretty amazing. Now, why is that? If it had something to do with the people, we could say that, well, the whole island would be a mess, but it's not. And guess what? There's a pretty significant wall that separates those two countries, and the Dominicans guard that wall because walls work. I had a very liberal friend, somebody I care deeply about, said walls don't work. And we don't have this in the outline today, Joe, but what are your thoughts? Do walls work anywhere? Have we seen walls work?
Man, look, I can't speak with any authority on that. I know that walls wouldn't work in Australia because I can't imagine. We've got a lot of land mass. we got a lot of areas we'd have to wall up. We can't even keep rabbits out, let alone people.
Yeah, I was going to say you had rabbit fences. Do those work?
Yeah, the rabbit-proof fence, man. That was one of the biggest engineering projects ever. But yeah, look, it's easy to mock, right? It's easy to say, oh, we'll just get a ladder, or we'll fly, or we'll catch a boat, but it's security. If we're going to backtrack to just general security, security is not about making something impenetrable. It's about making it harder. It's about making it less convenient. And the more steps you can make to make something less convenient, the more likely they are to choose to do something else. And if it means that everybody's coming via aircraft, then great. Now you can focus your attention on the aircraft because they're not walking through a porous border. So yeah, look, that's basic security theory. You create gaps so that you can allocate your forces to the gaps rather than having to spread your forces thin across a wide area. Again, Sun Tzu wrote about that 4,000 years ago.
Well, and we still teach it in the Marine Corps, surfaces and gaps, and our maneuver warfare doctrine is based on it. I was telling someone recently with regard to walls, I said, if I drew a security plan with concertina wire around this house, you would see these gaping gaps and you would say, well, Rich, you don't know what you're doing. I said, no, that's exactly what I'm doing because I'm going to channelize my fire in those gaps because people are going to hit those surfaces, that concertina wire, and it's going to funnel them right into where I want to funnel them to. So,
yeah, I mean, if you got 360-degree security, then you've got to watch 360 degrees.
Yeah. Let's look at some of the comments here, Joe. Let's see here. Sam says, great show, brother. Jason says, we need that. I agree. Donald says, let's see. Jared says, is it fair and reasonable to say we have American privilege? I would absolutely say we do. We have first world privileges. And let's see. Alan,
Can I just jump in there and say,
please.
I use the word privilege without the loading. I think privilege has been this word that's been weaponized over the last couple of years, 5 years, maybe, I don't know, 10 years, maybe, I don't know. But I mean, if you grew up with both parents together, that's a privilege, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you grew up knowing that you were going to have cornflakes for breakfast, that's a privilege compared to a lot of the world. And I don't think it's we sort of conflate privilege with guilt, and I think that's wrong. I don't think anyone should feel guilty about being privileged. It's just a matter of acknowledging that you've got something that a large portion of the world doesn't have, and what are you going to do with it to be grateful for it?
Yeah, great point. Matt says, we in the States enjoy a lot of luxuries others don't have. And when we don't have those, we get upset because it's become our way of life. Well said, Matt. Let's see. Jara says, good morning. Ted says, even in the higher level shitholes, food has no pleasure. Same spiced bad stuff every meal as we measure it. Matt says, once my children are a little older, we are looking at a mission trip, not just for spiritual growth and helping others, but as an eye-opener for my children. And that's exactly what led some of our good friends, Matt, to become missionaries. And they lived in the jungle for years. And it was a really incredible experience for their children. Now that they're back in the States after 4 or 5 years, it is, I see how it's impacted them. Rick says it's a privilege if you fight and sacrifice for it. Johnny.
Sorry, Rick, I'll say it's a privilege if you have the opportunity to fight and sacrifice and be rewarded for it.
Yeah.
So I think the opportunity to fight and sacrifice is a privilege in its own right.
To unpack that a little bit, because I'm reading that one way, but you may mean it completely different.
Yeah, basically, like, again, I'm fortunate to have traveled and have friends all over the world. And I know there are people that fight and scrape and do everything 14, 16-hour days just to earn enough rice to feed their kids. if you have the opportunity to fight and you have the option of working harder than you have to do to get ahead, that's fantastic. Some people in other countries, they don't have the option of working harder than they have to, because the amount they have to work is as hard as they humanly can work. So they don't have the option of getting ahead. So I think if we've got the option of putting in harder, yeah, by all means, be proud of it. Like by all means that you're contributing, you're probably hiring other people, you're creating opportunities for other people. That's fantastic, and no one should ever make you feel guilty. But the fact that you live in a country that it gives you the privilege of being able to do that and create that, be grateful for that and defend that.
Yeah, when you were, I guess I was initially reading that as the ability to defend that. I was thinking, well, that, thank God, is what our Second Amendment does. It gives every American the right, and enshrined in our law, self-defense. We have the ability to defend ourselves, because here in the States, Joe, we've had several Supreme Court cases. I believe there's 4 that I'm well aware of that outline that law enforcement is not there to protect you. It's not their job at all. Their job is to enforce the law without passion or prejudice. That's what they do. And if they can protect you at the same time, great. But is in nowhere in their mandate, your safety and security is up to you. That's why our tagline is, the fight is coming, be ready. And a lot of people have said, well, it's kind of prophetic now that what we're experiencing in 2020, but really it's always going to be there, right? As long as there are 2 human beings, there's a potentiality for that level of conflict.
Yeah, man. Look, anyone who's a student of history can be prophetic. We repeat the same patterns. And I know you're going to ask me in a little bit about what's going on in the US at the moment, and my perspective on that, I guess, as an outsider looking in. And it does worry me, because I see some of the same things happening in the US that I read about happening in Rome. Right? It's the fall of an empire. Things look scary, and I hope you can turn those around. But yeah, I mean, it's easy to be prophetic if you have a little bit of an understanding of how humans operate and how we've always done things. And as soon as the gloss comes off, we revert. So I agree with you.
Yeah, we'll unpack that a little bit later, because I think I love your parallels there, Joe, and I definitely want to. Let's jump into one of those now. In this current divisive climate that we're having, there seems to be a real market for verbal conflict management, both at the micro and the macro level. But I would just ask you, for the folks watching us today, thank you for watching us today, but also the thousands of folks that are watching the replay of today's show. Where do we even begin?
With verbal conflict management, you know what? The way you start verbal conflict management is the same way you start any conflict management, and that is by having empathy and respect for each other. And it sounds like a very touchy-feely way of explaining conflict, but to be completely honest, I mean, that's where it begins. Any conflict, if you seriously want to de-escalate it and you want to achieve a peaceful resolution, it has to start from mutual respect. And the hardest thing to do is when someone is behaving in a way that their behavior doesn't warrant respect, to then still respect them. And that comes from something I call emotional mapping and empathy, which is basically looking at the person and going, what would make me act that way? Why are they doing that? What is it that is in their head? What have they been told? How have they been raised? What beliefs have they been conditioned with? And in some way, looking at them as a newborn baby and going, you weren't born like this, right? And if you can at least have that little bit of empathy and go, you know what, you're a despicable human being right now, but you weren't always like this. Someone's done something, or you're under a really unique set of circumstances bringing out this really bad behavior in you. And I think if we can do that, we can then start to problem solve. We can start to figure out what's going on. People, when they get upset and they get angry, they start acting irrationally. There's usually only a handful of reasons. They're embarrassed, they're scared, they're trying to defend their place in a pack or perceived social hierarchy, or they feel like their security and their safety is being threatened in some way. So if you can understand what it is about the current situations that's making them feel that, then you can start to de-escalate. Then you can start to actually work on, is it something I'm doing? Is it something about the situation? Is it something about our surrounding that's doing this? One thing that scares the hell out of me at the moment is that people are so unaware of how manipulated they are. We don't trust anything anymore. We know it. There's no universal source of truth. Especially if you're not a spiritual person, you don't even trust the Bible. So who are you going to trust, right?
Right.
That's what scares the hell out of me, because I went back and I did a second degree in security studies, focusing on international security, and I'm aware of the mass manipulation of social media and bot farms and all the stuff that goes on, and how well you're tracked, and how well you can be manipulated to share something, to be fed false information, and then to stir up an emotional reaction, and then filter you into a group where a whole bunch of other people have the same anger issues, and then create an echo chamber so you all embolden each other. And yeah, it can be done accidentally, but it can also be done very deliberately by state actors, and that is what I see happening here. And we're probably 5 years behind what's happening in the US. I think there's a hell of a lot of manipulation that's taken place with not. I mean, the election is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the social unrest. That's not organic, I don't think.
No, it's not organic. And the thing now with social media being weaponized, and have you seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma yet, Joe?
I haven't seen it yet. No, it's queued up on my Netflix, but I haven't got to it yet.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I watched it a couple of nights ago, and I would encourage everybody watching and listening today, please watch that. Watch it with your children. Let them know the ways in which the artificial intelligence in the social media and what it's doing. And again, it's nothing necessarily nefarious, but it's the law of unintended consequences, right? I mean, once this thing, and the way one of them makes his point, Joe, is you have a AI, artificial intelligence, matter of fact, multiple AIs pointed at your brain every time you look at that screen, and it's manipulating you in ways that you can't even think. You may think that when you're scrolling, you're getting random content. There's nothing random about what you're seeing. It's playing to every bias that you have in order to just keep your eyes on the screen. That's all it wants to do, but it's playing on these emotional chords, right, Joe, to spin you up. And well, anyway,
can I'll just tell you, when the schools closed here with COVID and we had to do homeschooling, the schools were my daughter's school. I've got four daughters, right? Four young daughters, all under the age of 8, and they weren't quite prepared. So for the first couple of weeks, it was like, just do the best you can with homeschooling. We're getting some resources together, right? No pressure, just try and do the best you can. And I'm fortunate that I can work from home most of the time. So I was home with them. And I thought, you know what? Rather than trying to teach you guys numbers and colors and arithmetic and you're going to catch up on that anyway. Let me do something fun. So they love YouTube, right? All kids love YouTube. And I let them have their own YouTube channels, and I let them record videos, upload it, and then I showed them how YouTube markets and how they get likes, and how likes make other people see your video, and all this kind of stuff, and just kind of gave them a peek behind the curtain of how the search engine optimization and recommendations and all that sort of stuff, how that works, so they can see when they're being manipulated. Because prior to that, they're using my account for everything, and I was getting like 4,200 notifications a day when some kid YouTuber would upload a video. And I'm like, man, you're hitting the subscribe button on everything just because they tell you to. That was an interesting eye opener. I called it online business for 3rd grade. Seemed to have frozen Rich for a second. He did warn me if this happened that I'd give him 30 seconds and see if he came back. Let me jump onto the comments while we're waiting for Rich to come back. I'm just taking over his show now. Oh, here he comes. Hey, Rich, I was about to take over your show and start answering comments.
Sorry about that. Like I told you, Joe, we got bad Wi-Fi here in the county.
Oh, good. Rick says, what's the source of the manipulation? I've got guesses, but they're only guesses. I would do the age-old criminal question, right? Or
Yeah.
who benefits?
Exactly. Who benefits? And that's
Who
why I
ben-
think, like there's been a lot of the Internet Research Agency, I think is this sounds pretty innocuous, but I think it's really nothing more than a Russian bot farm. Or at least that's what I'm being told.
Well, man, look, I look at we know China interferes here. I mean, we're right in China's backyard. We've caught Chinese spies. They've caught our spies. Like this is an open secret that no one talks about. we're all friends, but we know we spy on each other. We know we interfere with stuff. And look, who benefits from civil unrest? Who benefits from America tearing each other apart? I mean, Bin Laden wrote in the 90s that no country was ever going to be militarily strong enough to engage and destroy the US one-on-one, but that the US could be goaded into a war that would lead to them tearing themselves apart. And I mean, that was prophetic. It's man, it's hard, but this is psychological warfare. This isn't conventional warfare.
Yeah, and the idea today that warfare takes on many forms. I did 23 years in the military. My brother did 20. My dad was in. His grandfather was in. So on and so on, all the way back to Scotland, I'm sure. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is now my oldest son works for the government, and he doesn't even know who his government clients are when they give him a piece of technology and say reverse engineer this. All I guess we could say is it came from some other country and we're going to reverse engineer it in order to hack in. But so my point, I guess I'm trying to say, Joe, is this idea of cyber warfare, right? That's the new frontier. That's where my son's going into. He's never going to be carrying a rifle on foreign soil, probably like I did and my brother did, et cetera. But he's engaged in daily warfare nonetheless, right?
Yeah, like in days gone by, we would poison the civilians to cause or accidentally leak up an animal to destroy crops. Right? We would do things to destabilize an environment that had nothing to do with a military force or an invasion or anything. It was just to create a headache for the government to deal with, so that they weren't paying as much attention to what was happening outside and left them more vulnerable for maybe it was 3 years or 6 years down the track that we wanted to actually invade. And now we're just seeing the natural technological progression of that. What is going to distract a government more than its citizens turning on each other, fighting in the streets, destroying businesses? Maybe we can throw a pandemic in there if we want to get crazy.
Yeah.
But,
I think China's playing the long game, and I know that here in America we're not and have not been playing the long game for, oh my God.
It's hard to play a long game with 4-year election cycles.
That's a great point.
China has always thought in terms of dynasty, not in terms of election.
Yeah.
Right? China can play a 200-year game because that's the way they've always done things. Right? The Chinese have always thought about legacy and dynasty, not about I've got a year to get established. I've got 2 years to actually get something done, and then I've got a year to campaign again to be able to keep going. Right? It's a really flawed system. I don't know that that longer terms are better from a democratic point of view, but it makes it hard to get things done when you're continually fighting to keep your job.
Yeah, exactly. And now that here in the United States, because the parties are so polarized, one of the concerns I have is that we've weaponized the process of impeachment. Now it's just going to be we're impeaching somebody every 6 months and we're getting nothing done. And all we're doing is looking internally when we should be looking outwardly. And part of that looking internally, I heard someone say that when you look at the fall of Rome or the fall of Greece, what you see is a lot of concern for gender identities. You see, what do we call hermaphrodites? I heard someone say this recently, and I haven't done any scholarly research on the topic, but I've taken what this historian said at face value. And that seems to be what we've got a lot of it here in the United States in 2019, 2018, 20, so on, that led us into this. And then you throw a pandemic on top of it and civil unrest. And man, our priorities are bonkers right now.
And again, you're dealing with a society in Rome that was privileged to a degree that it never experienced before. they had a level of prosperity that had never before been experienced in humanity. So they amplified problems to fill the gap that was left by the barbarians and the Celts and whoever else. It's
Next thing you know, the Visigoths are banging on the door and it's over.
Yeah, I mean, you got Mr. Caesar banging on about pumpkin spice, and all of a sudden, someone's throwing 7 heads over your wall.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess we've come to that point, Joe, where we ask, as you as an Australian looking in, what are your thoughts about what's going on in the U.S., where we're going, et cetera?
I said in a comment on Facebook a couple of days ago, actually after the debate, one of my American friends said, "Is it any better watching it knowing that it's not your house on fire?" and I said, yes and no, but it's kind of like your next door neighbor's house being on fire. Like it's not your house, but it's still your problem.
Yep.
That's pretty much what it's like for us. I mean, on a purely selfish level, much of our national security is tied into the U.S. Right now, we rely on the United States military for a lot of our defense. We don't have a big enough military to protect our borders. Thankfully, no one wants to invade us because they'd have to go through so much desert to get anything worthwhile. But it's the U.S. is a strategic ally for us. So I mean, from a purely self-interest point of view, it's worrying. On a personal level, I've got very, very good friends in the US. I've always had very strong relationships, and I've got people on the left and people on the right, and very intelligent people on both sides. People that are otherwise rational and intelligent and good quality human beings that are being baited into behaving as the worst of humanity. And that's what concerns me is the damage it's doing to relationships and the damage it's doing to social fabric that I don't know will be healed regardless of an election result. In fact, I think after the election, whichever way it goes, it'll be worse. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's 4 years away. I think it's a long time to repair that fabric. And I think probably the other piece for me, just reflecting upon that question, is I see the same thing happening here. We, as I said, we're about 5 years behind on a lot of the interference stuff. We went through a period where we had 5 prime ministers in 5 years, right? And the reason, and we have a 4-year cycle. And the reason that happened is that it was too much reliance on opinion polls. And as soon as a leader would start sinking in the opinion polls, the party would basically vote that they have no confidence in them, and they would be fired by the party and replaced by someone else within the party. And then obviously you go to an election, whenever the next election is, and then either that person would be voted out and replaced with someone else, and then the other party did the same thing. They would knife the prime minister in the back as soon as he was losing the opinion polls. And they've changed the legislation now, so that can't happen anymore. But it was the same thing. The opinion polls were largely influenced by what people are reading and hearing on the media and hearing on their social media. And it was causing panic because days gone by, no one really cared about what was in the opinion poll or your approval rating up until it was time for the election. Now it's like, well, you can do one like in an instant on Facebook, and every news channel is going to have an approval rating poll, and people will just jump and react. So I guess I see the same thing happening here. The pandemic has brought a lot of it out. We're seeing a right and left divide. We, believe it or not, we have Trump supporters and Biden supporters here. Although probably less Biden supporters. I don't think we actually have. We have Trump and anti-Trump. I think that's probably more accurate. I don't think anyone actually really likes Biden as an individual. Sorry to anyone, but I mean, here he doesn't have the media profile. But we've got people that certainly like Trump and people that certainly hate Trump. So yeah, look, I don't know what the answer is. My concern is that that fire is burning, and I'm really hoping someone puts it out.
Yeah, I think that analogy is really good. That we're the first world countries. The English speaking countries we're in the same apartment complex, and if there's a fire in America, it's definitely probably headed your way. Let's look at some of the comments we got coming in this morning. Douglas said, very interesting view on the 4-year election cycle. Jera says, our Constitution is inclusive for all citizens, so I don't understand singling out groups with new laws, enforce the laws, etc. Great point. Donald says, I've been all over the world in the military, and I see America turning into a third world crap hole. Jarrah says the confusion came when we gave into special interest groups. Yeah. Rick says, when are we going to hold media companies for publishing lies or faulty information? I think that's a great point. I've talked about that recently specifically with regard to Jacob Blake. Are you familiar with that, Joe?
Refresh my memory. The name
Jacob Blake was the gentleman up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, African American. He's walking away from the police, and the police shoot him in the back, right?
Yep.
Now, even me just saying that is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened. But that's exactly the way the media, when it first came out, it was unarmed black man shot in the back in front of his children. It's like, wow, that's incendiary. Let me read that article. And then when you read it and you start watching the videos that are coming out of it, you go, oh my God, that is absolutely not necessarily what happened. What happened is a guy that was wanted for sexual assault charges, as the two police officers try to arrest him because he's at the victim's house, they try to take him into lawful arrest. He resists arrest. There's a struggle. He puts one of them in a headlock. He takes 2 taser strikes. He's got a knife. He's going back to his car. He says he's going to get his gun, and then he's shot. Mm-hmm. So it's like, but
that doesn't fit in the headline, though, does it?
No, you can't say that in 3 or 4 words. So what you end up with is cities burning to the ground, and in this narrative, I think that's part of the problem. I don't know if you would agree with that, Joe, but the narratives get out there so fast with social media, and nobody reads the retraction and nobody reads the substance of the article. They read the headline and they just go.
Yeah. And I was going to mention that the attention span is so short that no one's even going to bother watching even if you put their headline followed by the video of the incident, no one's going to watch the video. They saw the headline. It was enough to confirm their bias. The groups that they're part of are already up in arms. There's a protest group that's already organized for your neighborhood coming up because this has happened. And it's so vast. And look, we saw some really great positives in the early days of Facebook and social media that were able to overthrow governments that were legitimate dictatorships, right? We saw Cairo Spring, right? We saw some stuff that was arguably positive, but the same thing is happening in reverse. And to the question about media, as long as the media is a for-profit business, you're never going to control it because they operate on clicks and advertising. And if it's incendiary and it makes you click, if it makes you angry and you click it just to see if you should be angry, or if it makes you happy and you click it just because you want to be happy, same result, right? They pander to their groups that are their subscribers because that's how they get paid. And if we want to embrace capitalism, we have to embrace that as well. You can't. You want something to be moral, then you need to take money away from it somehow.
Well, your point is incredibly. I agree with you 100%. In capitalism, it's your company, Mark Zuckerberg. You do with Facebook what you want, but I think you might want to start trying to play a longer game. You know, if you make $1 billion in a country that our currency becomes worthless, then what have you really done? And I think to your point, you know, we talked a lot about triangulating the news. You know, if I read something that confirms my bias, I'm well aware of the cognitive bias of confirmation bias. So I start reading somewhere else. What does Reuters have to say about this? What does the BBC say about it? What is, MSNBC or Fox? Or I'm having to read everything to try to triangulate the truth in there. And that's, most people don't have time for it, or they don't have the intellectual sophistication to say, oh, this confirms my bias. I better pump the brakes and go and read something else.
Yeah, look, I have this conversation with my parents a bit. I mean, my parents are 70, and they kind of just buy the first thing they see, right? The first thing that hits the news or it hits their Facebook feed, they buy it because that used to be a pretty sound strategy, that if someone published it, it went through several layers of control, and the editor had to approve it, and they weren't going to put something up that was blatantly false. Now, like when you've got a live 24/7 news cycle, I mean, I watch the live press conference feed of our coronavirus press conference every morning. I just read the updates, I mean, no one has proofread that. Like it's going straight up with typos and everything else, let alone fact checking. No one's fact checking anything, right?
No.
There's a narrative here that's going to get us a couple of clicks, and if it's wrong, we can retract it later. No one's going to bother reading it anyway. So
yeah. Let's see. And I've talked a lot about this as it relates to being a criminal investigator in the Marine Corps. You know, I had one case where by the time I was done with it, it was, you know, about this thick. And because there's so many different findings of fact, I cannot have charges. I can't do anything until, but again, who wants to read through something that's, you know, this thick? They don't. And they don't have the time. But I will tell you that if you approach everything almost as a criminal investigator does, and what is a finding of fact? Let me read the report. I don't want to read the abstract. Let me look at the scientific data. Let's dig into this. But who has time for that? I don't have time for that. I've got a life. I've got a career. And I just wish there was someone out there that was like, here's the facts. It's going to take some nuance. It's going to take some time. But if you want me to unpack this for you, let's go down the rabbit hole.
It's but you know, there has to be an established appetite to actually hear the truth. And I think coming back to how one of the first things I said, man is not a rational animal. He's a rationalizing animal. And I think we decide what our truth is, and then we seek the information that supports that for most people. And I think it's good to check your bias every now and then. But most people either they're not aware of it or they don't care.
Well, another interesting book I would encourage everybody to read, I think it's 100 pages or less, is Lying with Statistics. Have you ever read that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating book. In stats class in college, they made us read that. And just the way that, you know, there's 3 different ways to give an average: the mean, the median, and the mode. But all 3 is going to give you something different. And I can look you in the eye and go, well, you know, the average is this. Well, is that the mean, the median, or the mode? You don't know. And I can intentionally lie with that. And there's ways that you can lie with charts and graphs. And I would encourage everybody to look at that. And then you can easily spot when you're being manipulated. And again, manipulated to what end? I think you're right. I think instead of thinking that there's some evil person on the other end of that device, I think more often than not, it's just pure capitalism.
Straight up profit. Yeah. And when you're motivated by profit, then integrity kind of can take a back seat. And this is an issue when you've got shareholders to answer to. I mean, that's another. When you're one person who owns a company, you can have some integrity still. When you got shareholders, harder, because now you got to talk about collective values, collective morals. Yeah, that's a different ball. but yeah, look, man, it's worrying the impact it has. I don't know how it plays out. It concerns me that we don't really have anything that we can objectively trust, because it overwhelms us to have to figure all this stuff out for ourselves. And I think we end up in a position now where nobody trusts anything, because if it doesn't come from the news source of choice, then it must be wrong. And if they share something from their news source of choice, their friends tell them they're lying, or they're conspiracy theorists or whatever. And we just end up fighting over more stuff.
Well, and what's interesting, you bring up the conspiracy stuff. There's been people saying for years, there's this pedophile island and all this, and people are just like rolling their eyes. And then you find out there's this guy named Jeffrey Epstein who's a billionaire, and he really runs a pedophile island. So I think it gives license to a lot of people that have these fringe ideas like, oh, see, I told you.
That's confirmation bias. Right?
Exactly.
I think Richard Dimitri told me once, he said, anything you can imagine doing to another human being, someone has actually done it for real. There's whatever the most grotesque, horrific thing you can possibly imagine, someone's done it. And just because it's happened doesn't mean that everybody does it. But the fact that someone has done it, and you will find like, oh my God, that's actually a thing.
Yeah,
of course. It's a base human desire for enough people. Someone with enough money will do it. It's horrific. But yeah, conspiracies are a fun one. That's definitely another part. That's another part to this conversation.
Americans love their conspiracies. Where is all this lawlessness going, Joe? Where are we heading?
Man, if I knew the answer to that, I think we're heading back. I hope and it could be a short journey or a long journey, depending on how things play out. But I think we're heading back to a time of self-reliance. I think we're going to see large systems fail, and I think there's going to be a lot said for people that can make do on their own. Whether that's people that are comfortable getting off grid, or whether it's people that are not relying on police, not relying on ambulance, not relying on their city to provide things for them. I think those people will have an advantage, because I think as the infrastructure of society is questioned and I guess the foundations are cracking, you don't want to be reliant on those systems, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we might have hit a tipping point where we are too affluent. Yeah, maybe we're too spoiled, and maybe this is the natural evolution of things when you get too much, and maybe we need a reckoning to knock us back down a peg and go back to knowing our neighbors and sharing the eggs from your chicken with your neighbor's sugar or whatever, right? Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need to go back to those days to actually have some respect for each other and elect leaders that can lead. I don't know. Maybe it'll be a good thing for us. But I do think that we're going to end up back in that way. To quote Albert Einstein, I'm not sure what weapons that World War II will be fought with, but World War III. I'm not sure what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah.
I think we're going to end up in a point where we have a dramatic reset, one way or another.
No, I think you're on point, Joe. And I had when I retired from the Marine Corps, I took a position in disaster relief with the Red Cross. So I worked a lot of disasters, and I would see that exactly what you said. There was a lot of beauty that came from the disaster. People working together. There's destruction, yeah, I get it, but post-destruction, you see the absolute best of humanity, taking care of one another, feeding one another, housing one another, beautiful stuff coming out of it. But one of the things that we talked about in disasters, there was blue sky and gray sky. So there was blue sky where you had the opportunity to prepare for something that's coming, and then gray sky is the disaster and cleaning up from that. So I think the concern I have with this pandemic that we're in is that it erodes one of the foundational principles of disaster preparedness, and that is that all disaster is local. And what they mean by that is the disaster is local to where you are, and that's a good thing. You can work together and help each other as a community and come together, but you can also drive out of the disaster. So if you see it coming, you can move away. But with this global pandemic, where are you going to go? Because I wanted you to touch on how Australia is dealing with the pandemic, what it looks like there. I mean, here in America, we know what it looks like, but what are you guys experiencing with your disaster?
Yeah, so I'm actually right in the center of the worst affected area. In fact, our second wave happened about the genesis of our second wave. That in terms of numbers, it's nothing compared to the US, but it crippled our whole state, and that happened literally about a 5-minute drive from my house. So I'm right in the epicenter. But we have seen really unprecedented levels of government intervention when it comes to our way of living, and everything's been handled on a state-by-state basis with some federal oversight. The first wave was very much the federal government, the Australian government, sort of dictated how things were going to be done, and all the states came to the same table, and everyone had the same rules. Once the first wave was more or less under control, and we achieved that fairly quickly, and then we started seeing pockets appearing in certain states. Then it went to sort of a state-by-state basis, because each state had a different circumstance or different situation to deal with, which was fair enough. In my state of Victoria, in particular in the city of Melbourne, we went from having, I think prior to the second wave, there'd been like 11 deaths across the entire country. We've now hit over 800 deaths in Melbourne in the second wave. So in just the rate, the exponential growth was incredible. And whether you agree or disagree with the way it was handled, what the result was is that the premier of the state, so our equivalent of a governor, applied a state of disaster, which is normally reserved for a natural disaster, basically. For us, usually a flood. It's usually or catastrophic bushfires, for example. So we had a state of disaster in January for the bushfires, and then another state of disaster was declared in June, which has never happened before. And the state of disaster is only supposed to be, it's only legislated for 6 weeks. It can't be extended, but it was extended again, and then extended again, and extended again. And what that state of disaster allows them to do is to create new laws, create new penalties, to utilize the police to enforce the directives of the chief health officer. And that led to some really interesting situations, like we're a quote unquote free city operating with a curfew. So for up until very recently, in Melbourne, between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m., you were not allowed out of your house. And if you were out of your house to work, like you had a night job, you had to have a work permit or you could be fined. So that was interesting. Right? That's never happened before in our history. There's still right now is a 5-kilometer radius curfew, so I can't be more than 5 kilometers away from my house. And that was to limit human travel, spreading the virus, leaving it localized so the clusters could be addressed. Yeah, ostensibly. All right. And I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not going to pretend to be one. But your face mask became mandatory in public. You can be fined for not wearing a mask in public unless you've got a health issue. Nearly every business got shut down for a period of time, other than food and a couple of essential services. So, I mean, you're seeing crippling economic impact, like decades of economic impact to manage this virus. Was it necessary? I don't know. I guess the inquiries and history will tell us. But certainly, it's been quite scary as a student of history and society to see how quickly life could be turned upside down at the whim of somebody who was an elected official, who could then say, "Hey, you don't have freedom of movement anymore. You don't have freedom of association anymore." But like for me now, I'm coming up on nearly 6 months where the rule has been you can only leave your house to get food, to work if you can't work from home, to provide care, or to exercise. And by the way, your exercise is limited to 1 hour per day on your own. I've traveled to Soviet countries and communist countries, and they were more liberal than that. So that's interesting. Like, I'm not gonna, again, I'm glad I'm not making the call. I'm glad I'm not the one making the decision, but the slippery slope is apparent. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Where come the 19th of October, we're supposed to have a high number of those restrictions lifted, but we'll see. Things have been very fluid. That said, most of the rest of the country is more or less normal. Like there's some density controls in place. Like stadiums are operating, but they're only allowed to sit like every second seat. They're doing some stuff like restaurants and cafes have a set number of tables they're allowed to have out, that kind of thing. And I think that'll probably be where we end up next year here as well. But yeah, it's been quite interesting and a little bit scary as a student of history.
Hey, I'm back.
So you just looked like you had a really long blink.
Oh, hey, I wanted to say, if you're just waking up to Coffee with Rich, good morning. We've been talking to Joe Saunders this morning from the Managing Violence podcast. Thanks for joining us. But if you're just waking up, you're probably waking up to the news here in America that President Trump and the First Lady have both tested positive for COVID and are entering a 14-day quarantine. And then, of course, the media is quick to say, oh, my God, we're in a constitutional crisis. What are we doing if the president's incapacitated? He could be incapacitated right now. Who's really running the government? So you're probably waking up to that this morning, and we'll see how that plays out the rest of the day, and of course, the next 14 days as we move through this.
Rich, sorry to cut you off, man. I just, in another window I have open right now, the front page of news.com.au, which is our biggest online news service here in Australia. The top story is doomsday planes in the air. Fleet mobilizes after Trump virus test. Nuclear panic.
Okay, see, there you go.
Right. So, I mean, you want to talk about someone having a story out of nothing, and yet now we've got half the world concerned that America's going to be nuked because the the POTUS has a sniffle.
Yeah, who's controlling the nuclear football right now? I guarantee you somebody is, and just relax. We're going to be okay.
I'm sure there's contingencies in place.
But it does it is an opportunity for our enemies to stir the pot, whether it's stirring the pot with the cyber warfare or social media, or legitimately putting satellites in the air. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do, but it's an opportunity for those that wish us harm, right?
Yeah, look, anytime your enemy is destabilized, you'd be silly not to take advantage. And
yeah.
Anyone who hasn't listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories, and I highly recommend you check out his series on the Mongols, the Wrath of the Khans. I was just listening to it again. I hadn't listened to it in about 5 years, and man, what made the Mongols so incredible, and this is we're going back 1,000 years, was that they had a really developed intelligence service, and they would attack their neighbors when they were politically destabilized.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's when they would invade, when they knew they didn't have a force that was unified. And hey, worked for them. Worked in the 1100s. It works in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely works in 2020. Well, Joe, I've kept you on here for an hour and a half so far, and thank you for your time. I've got to get you back on because there's so much more that I want to dig into that big brain of yours and hear more. But where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. So probably the best place to go is violencepod.com. So violencepod.com. That's the main website for the Managing Violence podcast. Managing Violence podcast on Facebook. Managing Violence Tribe is my group on Facebook if you want to interact with other listeners of the show. Look, the show is ostensibly it's about violence, quite obviously, but it's a mixture of self-defense and combatives type stuff, but also a lot of academics and threat assessment and post-incident trauma management and all sorts of, like, the whole spectrum of violence. It's not just a self-defense show. So if you're interested in any of that kind of stuff, by all means. Look, I'm on all the social media platforms. So if you're on one and you want to reach out, I'm either Joe Saunders or Managing Violence, depending on which platform. So yeah.
All right. Looks like we said, Kat says, great show, Rich. Got to go. I'll catch the end replay. Donald says, thanks again. Enjoyed it. Jara says, great show. Gerald says, great show. Paul says, great show. I shared it. Thank you for everybody that watched today live. I'm sorry we had some technical difficulties. Thank you for everybody that are going to watch the replay today. Thank you. A special thank you to Joe for being up late here in Australia and coming on the show with us. Thank you, sir, for being on. And final comments, Joe.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm more than happy to do it again. Look, I know I'm just looking at the comments, like, you guys are nearly exclusively a US audience, and just know that we're with you guys. We want to see you guys come through this united, stronger than ever. I'm not ready to see a world without US as the leading power, not yet, because I don't think that transition is going to be a whole lot of fun. But we're pulling for you guys, regardless of who gets up in November, regardless of what happens 4 years from now. We want you guys united and strong. So yeah, God bless you from Australia.
Yeah, God bless you, brother. And God bless everybody that watches today and in the days and weeks to come. Remember, the fight is coming. Be ready.